We often assume, don't we, that more formal education always equals more wealth. Get the degree, get the good job, society
Right.
prospers.
It's almost like a fundamental equation we're taught. More
Mhm.
schooling equals more success, both for individuals and, well, for whole countries.
It really is deeply ingrained, a kind of mantra in modern society. But what if the very foundations of that belief are maybe built on something less solid?
Built on sand, perhaps?
Exactly. What if the real path to prosperity isn't paved with all those diplomas and, academic theories?
What if it's something, well, earthier,
Yeah.
less glamorous?
And maybe surprisingly counterintuitive.
Well, that's exactly where we're going today. We're taking a deep dive into some really provocative ideas from Nassim Taleb's groundbreaking work, Antifragile.
Ah, Taleb. He never shies away from challenging conventional wisdom, does he?
No, he certainly doesn't. And he goes head on here, especially when it comes to our assumptions about education, about wealth creation, and this really crucial, often missed distinction between, let's say, theoretical understanding, what he calls talking, and actual real-world doing.
Talking versus doing. Okay.
It's a fascinating and sometimes, frankly, unsettling look at what he famously termed the green lumber fallacy.
Right. The green lumber fallacy. We'll definitely unpack that. So, our mission for this deep dive then is to really get into this paradox.
Exactly. We want to explore why the doers, the practitioners, often succeed where the thinkers, even those armed with all the supposedly right knowledge, might stumble.
And uncover the real sources of antifragility, that amazing ability not just to withstand chaos and disorder, but to actually gain from it.
Yes. And we'll be pulling insights directly from the sources you've shared, offering hopefully a fresh, maybe even a slightly unsettling perspective on what it genuinely means to be, well-informed.
Okay, sounds fascinating. Let's begin this exploration, I say. The paradox of progress. Does education really lead to wealth? So you mentioned Taleb has some incredibly strong opinions, particularly about how some nations, especially oil-rich ones, try to essentially buy knowledge.
Oh, absolutely. He starts with a very specific, almost pointed critique.
Looking at places like Abu Dhabi, describing them as, what was it, a city that sprang out of desert as if watered by oil?
That's the one. You see these incredible glittering skylines, and right alongside them, these huge investments in what look like top-tier knowledge infrastructure, universities, research centers.
But he finds this frustrating, even, I think the source said, nauseating. Why such a strong reaction to building universities? Isn't that a good thing?
Well, for Taleb, it's not just frustration, it's a deep philosophical issue.
Yeah.
It stems from what he sees as a fundamental misunderstanding of how knowledge is actually, generated, how it's integrated into a society. He sees these governments pouring vast oil revenues into building these massive universities, or even just importing prestigious names, hiring professors from the West, setting up branches of NYU or the Sorbonne.
Right, like franchising education.
Exactly. And he argues this approach comes from a superstition rather than empiricism. It's
Huh?
this deep-seated belief, he says, but it's not backed by evidence, that you can just turn oil money into knowledge by building fancy buildings and hiring smart people.
As if knowledge is just another commodity you can purchase off the shelf.
Precisely. Like you can buy a ready-made intellectual ecosystem, plug it in, and boom, you have a knowledge economy. Like watering a plant and expecting it to bloom overnight.
And his verdict on this is pretty harsh. He calls it completely sterile.
He does. He sees it as a great transfer of resources, even a massive transfer of wealth. But the transfer is from these regions to the Western academic institutions selling their brand.
So it's not actually creating genuine local knowledge or expertise within those societies, in his view.
That's his core argument.
But hang on, couldn't you argue that even if it's initially imported, surely it eventually seeds local talent? Doesn't it trickle down, so to speak? What's the crucial missing piece for Taleb that makes him label it sterile?
That's the conventional wisdom, isn't it? And it sounds logical. But for Taleb, the critical missing ingredient, the absolute elephant in the room, is the profound lack of stressors in this model.
Stressors. You mean challenges, difficulties.
Exactly. Where's the pressure? Where's the struggle? Where's the genuine need that drives real innovation and practical problem solving? He immediately connects this to ancient wisdom, quoting Seneca. Sophistication is born of need and success of difficulties.
Ah, necessity is the mother of invention.
Precisely that. It's not just a nice saying, it's a fundamental principle. We see it everywhere, even in modern psychology with post-traumatic growth, the idea that overcoming adversity makes you stronger. more resilient.
So without that friction, that organic struggle.
You don't develop robust, adaptable knowledge. You don't build systems that are truly anti-fragile. This kind of artificial prosperity built purely on imported wealth without those organic stressors essentially bypasses the necessary stages of development. It's like trying to grow a strong oak tree in a perfectly calm greenhouse without ever exposing it to the wind. It might look okay, but it has no real strength.
That's a really powerful image, the lack of struggle leading to fragility. Okay, so this brings us to the really big fundamental question Taleb tackles. Is this widely accepted idea that lecture-driven knowledge leads to prosperity actually true?
Yeah.
Especially at a national level.
Yeah, it feels almost self-evident, doesn't it? We're
Yeah.
taught it from day one. More education equals better jobs, higher incomes, wealthier society. Simple.
But Taleb questions this basic premise.
He absolutely does,
Yeah.
based on what he calls serious empirical investigation. And he specifically cites work by a World Bank economist named Lan Pry. He asserts there's no evidence that raising the general level of education raises income at the level of the country.
No evidence. That's quite a claim.
It is. And in fact, his research, his observations, they suggest the opposite might be true.
The opposite.
That wealth leads to the rise of education. Wealth comes first, and then societies invest more in formal education, perhaps as a luxury good or for credentialing, but not as the primary engine of that wealth creation itself.
So the causal arrow is flipped.
That's what his analysis suggests. He says you see it if you look at historical data over time, not just snapshot correlations of countries today.
And he backs us up with some, well, pretty striking examples from the sources, right? They really make you stop and think.
They do. Consider this. Taiwan versus the Philippines in 1960. Taiwan had much lower literacy, about half the income per person compared to the Philippines back then.
Okay.
Fast forward to today. Taiwan's income per person is now 10 times that of the Philippines, a complete reversal.
Wow. Despite starting with lower literacy.
Exactly. Or look at Korea versus Argentina, again in 1960. Korea had much lower literacy, maybe 1/5 the income per person compared to Argentina. And now, Korea's income is about 3 times Argentina's. Again, a massive shift that doesn't align with the education-first model.
And there was the example of sub-Saharan Africa, too.
Yes, perhaps the most sobering. Many countries there have seen markedly increasing literacy rates in recent decades. Great news on the surface. But tragically, this progress has often been accompanied with a decrease in their standard of living.
So higher literacy, lower living standards. That directly contradicts the expected link.
It does. These aren't just anomalies. Taleb argues they point to a fundamental flaw in our reasoning.
Which is?
It's how easily we're fooled by randomness, as he loves to say. We're mistaking a merely associative for the causal.
Meaning we see two things together and assume one caused the other?
Precisely. People see rich countries are generally well-educated. The immediate inference, almost automatic, is education made them rich. But Taleb says, hold on, did you check for epiphenomena?
Epiphenomena. Secondary effects.
Yeah, things that are correlated with wealth but aren't the cause of it. Think about it like this. Very wealthy people often own expensive Swiss watches. Does wearing a Patek Philippe make you wealthy?
No. I wish.
Right, it's a result or a signal of wealth, an epiphenomenon. Taleb argues that at the national level, high levels of education often function similarly. They might be a luxury afforded by wealth or a consequence of it, rather than its primary driver.
And he asks that provocative question. Why don't we make the same mistake with negative correlations?
Exactly. Why don't people see that wealthy countries also tend to have, say, higher rates of certain types of decadence or higher suicide rates, and then infer that those things must cause wealth?
Because it doesn't fit our preferred narrative.
Precisely. It highlights our bias. We want to believe that good things like education cause other good things like wealth, so we jump to that conclusion without rigorously checking the direction of causality.
Okay, this is a crucial distinction, but just to be absolutely clear, Taleb isn't throwing the baby out with the bathwater here. He's not saying education is useless for individuals, is he?
No, not at all. He makes that distinction very carefully. He absolutely acknowledges that for an individual, education builds helpful credential for one's own career. It can definitely open doors.
And it can help families maintain wealth across generations, right?
Yeah.
He gives that example.
Yes, the merchant example. The merchant makes money through practical skill, through doing. Then his children go off to the Sorbonne, become doctors, magistrates, whatever.
They get the diploma.
Right. And that diploma, that credential, helps the family retain its wealth and status, maybe long after the original source of the wealth is dried up. It provides stability, a foothold in the professional class. It acts like a kind of insurance policy.
So useful for individuals in terms of credentials and maybe wealth preservation.
Absolutely. The individual benefits are real. But, and this is the critical point Taleb emphasizes, that these individual effects wash out at the country level.
Yeah.
They don't scale up to drive national prosperity in the way we assume.
And he brings in Alison Wolf's work here.
Yes, he relies heavily on her analysis. She meticulously debunks that common logical leap people make. The jump from saying, okay, obviously Microsoft or British Aerospace need highly educated people, to concluding, therefore, more education spending across the board means more national wealth.
It seems logical, but...
But Wolf argues that this simple one-way relationship is what seduces politicians and policymakers. Her research suggests that the link between general education spending and economic growth output simply don't exist at that macro-national level, especially as the education sector itself grows larger, more complex, and consumes more resources without necessarily generating proportionate GDP growth.
It becomes its own industry almost.
In a way, yes. Growing for its own sake, justified by a narrative that isn't strongly supported by the national economic data.
And the Egypt example fits right in here.
Perfectly. Egypt underwent a giant leap in education, a massive expansion. But it clearly did not translate into highly cherished golden GDP growth. It's a real-world case study showing the disconnect.
Okay, so if education isn't primarily about driving national economic growth, what is its valid purpose from a policy perspective? According to Taleb, is he against government funding for education altogether?
Not necessarily. He clarifies that his argument is not against adopting governmental educational policy of noble aim. There are other valid reasons, such as reducing inequality in the population, providing access to culture, to good literature, letting people read Dickens, Victor Hugo, Julian Grasp, simply for personal enrichment and understanding the world.
So education for its own sake, for cultural value?
Yes, or for social goals like increasing the freedom of women in poor countries, which, as a beneficial side effect, also tends to decrease birth rates. These are worthy goals.
But the key point is?
The key point is, one should not use the excuse of growth or wealth in such matters. Pursue these goals because they are intrinsically valuable, he argues. Not because you think they're a magic bullet for GDP growth, because the evidence for that link is weak. Be honest about the reasons.
Value the right things for the right reasons. It ties into that anecdote about Alison Wolf at the party.
Yes, that's a great one. She's presenting her evidence, showing the limited link between education spending and national growth, and someone gets really annoyed, really defensive.
Understandable, it challenges a core belief.
And her simple, almost brutally honest response: real education is disappointing.
Wow. That just cuts right through the hype, doesn't it? Feels like a perfect, if slightly painful, summary of Taleb's whole stance.
It really does. It punctures that romanticized view we have. And it highlights the distinction Taleb constantly makes between genuine scholarship and organized education.
What's the difference for him?
His skepticism isn't aimed at the pure pursuit of knowledge, scholarship for its own sake. It's aimed at the brand of commoditized, repackaged, pink-quoted knowledge stuff one can buy in the open market and use for self-promotion.
Education as a product, a status symbol?
Exactly. Designed more to confer credentials and signal belonging than to cultivate deep understanding or practical skills.
Yeah.
He even tells another story about being at a fancy dinner.
Oh, yeah.
And someone was lamenting the education level in the United States. And Taleb, being Taleb, disagreed. He said America's values were convex risk-taking.
Convex risk-taking, meaning?
Taking risks where the potential upside is way bigger than the potential downside.
Yeah.
Like small bets with huge potential payoff. Asymmetrical bets.
Okay.
And he actually expressed gladness that America wasn't like, what do you call these helicopter mom cultures?
Helicopter moms hovering over the kids.
Yeah, parents who are hovering over the children with resources, constantly intervening, dropping a chocolate bar at the first sign of difficulty, instead of letting them develop resilience through, well, trial and error, through experiencing minor failures.
That's such a vivid image. Constantly optimizing, controlling, preventing struggle, rather than letting organic development happen.
It connects perfectly back to his point about universities and the purpose of learning. He contrasts the modern focus with the ancient view.
Where learning was for learning's sake.
Right. Primarily to make someone a good person worth talking to cultivate virtue and understanding, not to increase the stock of gold in cities' heavy-guarded coffers.
Whereas now, the focus is so often on the salary package, asking Kit and Ahai, how big is the paycheck?
Exactly. It's a shift from intrinsic values, ethics, moral codes, genuine understanding to purely instrumental utility. Education measured solely by its economic output.
So just to button this section up, Taleb isn't saying universities are useless or don't generate any knowledge.
No, that would be simplistic. His core point is that their role is overly hyped up. And he argues that members of the academic establishment often exploit some kind of gullibility by establishing these wrong causal links, mostly based on superficial impressions or correlations,
They create a self-serving narrative that overstates their direct economic impact.
which then justifies funneling massive resources their way,
Right.
potentially diverting those resources from other, less visible, but maybe more effective ways of generating real knowledge and wealth. It's a feedback loop, she suggests, built on a convenient but empirically shaky foundation. 2. The green lumber fallacy. Doing versus talking.
Okay, so if wealth often precedes widespread education rather than the other way around, and if genuine useful knowledge isn't something you can just buy off the shelf, it forces the question, doesn't it? Where does real, actionable knowledge actually come from?
And why do we so often misidentify its source?
Exactly. Which brings us perfectly to that other cornerstone idea you mentioned, the green lumber fallacy.
This one is brilliant.
It has a great origin story, doesn't it? It's all about mistaking one kind of knowledge for another, right? The difference between skills at doing and skills at talking.
Precisely. The story comes from a financial book, What I Learned Losing $1 Million. The author talks about this incredibly successful trader, Joe Siegel, who traded a commodity called green lumber.
Okay, green lumber.
Now, here's the kicker. Siegel actually thought that it was a lumber painted green. He literally believed the name referred to the color.
Wait, really? He didn't know it meant freshly cut, undried wood.
Apparently not. That was the actual definition in the market. Meanwhile, the book's author, armed with all his grand intellectual theories and narratives about economics and commodity markets, he went bust.
Well, Siegel, the guy who thought green lumber was painted green, made a fortune.
Consistently, year after year.
That's incredible. So the insight here isn't just that Siegel was ignorant about the formal definition.
No, that's only half the story. Taleb points out Siegel also knew things about lumber that non-experts things are important, people we call ignorant.
What kind of things?
Things related to the actual doing of the job. Predicting order flow, understanding market sentiment, knowing the players, the logistics, the subtle dynamics that actually move the price. Stuff that had little to do with the details one would assume from the outside are important, like the official definition.
So he had deep, tacit knowledge of the practice, even if he lacked the formal, theoretical description.
Exactly. It's like a master carpenter who knows wood intuitively, how it behaves, how to work it, but maybe couldn't give you a lecture on dendrology. The success is in the doing, not the talking about the doing.
And this green lumber fallacy, this concept, it really shook Taleb's own worldview, didn't it?
Oh, profoundly.
Yeah.
He describes it as shattering his intellectual world. He came from this highly polished Ivy League environment, right? Where academic knowledge, articulate arguments, sophisticated theories, that was the currency.
And then he became a derivatives trader.
Right. And suddenly he had to cohabit with foreign exchange traders, people just buying and selling currencies day in, day out. High pressure, fast pace.
And he expected sophisticated financiers discussing monetary policy.
Pretty much. He expected cosmopolitan fellows who were escorts at the opera, people deeply versed in economics, geopolitics, maybe advanced math.
And the reality.
The reality, he says, hit him on day one. The FX world was mostly composed of New Jersey, Brooklyn, Italian fellows, very street people, guys who'd started in the back office, worked their way up as the market exploded. Not academics.
They didn't speak intelligible English in the way he expected.
Not in the polished academic sense, no. It was the language of the trading floor, quick, intuitive, maybe rough around the edges, but effective for what they needed to do.
And then there was that specific trader, the Swiss franc guy.
B.
Hmm.
Yes, that story is pivotal for Taleb. This guy B was a legendary Swiss franc trader. He'd apparently predicted a big dollar collapse in 1980s and controlled huge positions, made a fortune, a real market wizard.
Okay.
But Taleb discovered B could not place Switzerland on the map.
Seriously, the biggest Swiss franc trader didn't know where Switzerland was.
Or even that they spoke Italian there. He'd never been. Taleb says he started freaking out, watching all these years of education evaporating in front of my eyes. He realized his sophisticated knowledge was utterly irrelevant to B's success.
Wow, that must have been a shock.
He says that very day, he stopped reading economic reports.
Yeah.
That was the beginning of his de-intellectualization regarding markets.
And it wasn't just New York, right? London was even more extreme.
Oh, yeah. He describes the London traders as sub-blue collar. The most successful players, he says, were entirely Cockney.
Cockney, like East London street guys.
Exactly, using their own slang, their own distinctive accent, even their own numbering system like Lady Godiva for 5. He said he had to learn the Cockney just to communicate and mostly to drink with my colleagues.
He even mentions Brooklyn guys trying to imitate Cockney accents to be understood on calls.
Hilarious, right? But it underscores the point. Success in that world wasn't about sophisticated language or theory. It was about practical execution, street smarts, and maybe a shared, somewhat rough culture.
So the big lesson he took from all this.
The profound realization that price and reality, as seen by economists, are not the same thing. The relationship is just too complex to map mathematically or capture in neat theories.
But these non-sentence salve people, as he calls them.
These guys, without the fancy degrees or the articulate explanations, they know deep inside how to navigate it, how to handle the optionality, exploit the asymmetries, avoid blowing up, even if they can't write a paper explaining why it works. It's tacit knowledge earned through skin in the game.
What really strikes me here is the selection mechanism. You realize that entrepreneurs, especially in, say, technical jobs, they are selected to be just doers, not thinkers. It's actually unfair and wrong and downright insulting, Taleb says, to measure them in the talk department.
Their value is in the output, not the articulation.
Exactly. Same with artisans. The quality lies in their product, not in the conversation. And what's fascinating is that he suggests they can even hold false beliefs, narratives that aren't strictly true, but which somehow help them make better products or take better actions.
Like a useful fiction that motivates them or simplifies their process.
Right. And he contrasts this sharply with, say, bureaucrats.
Yes, the bureaucrats.
Because they often lack clear, objective metrics for success, no real market forces judging their output. They end up being selected on the hollow effects of shallow looks and elegance.
Which, ironically, makes them better at conversation, better at crafting plausible narratives.
Even if their actions don't produce tangible results, it's a really sharp, maybe cynical, but deeply insightful point about who gets rewarded in different environments.
Sets up the Fat Tony example perfectly.
Right, Fat Tony. Taleb's practical alter ego, the embodiment of the green lumber fallacy in action. Let's get into his situation during the 1991 Kuwait War.
Okay, so Iraq invades Kuwait. Oil market in turmoil.
Yeah.
Every intelligent person in socioeconomics, Taleb says, had their theory probability scenarios, their geopolitical analysis.
And they all predicted
Oil prices would rise. It seemed obvious, right? War in the Gulf, supply disruption, prices have to go up.
Makes sense. But Fat Tony...
Fat Tony didn't even know where Iraq was. Taleb jokes he might have thought it was a province in Morocco or some emirate with spicy food east of Pakistan. Geopolitics. Zero.
Yet, he bet against it. He bet oil prices would fall.
He did, and his logic, or maybe instinct is a better word, had nothing to do with the war narrative.
What was it based on then?
Simple market mechanics. He just knew there had been too much holding, too much inventory of oil globally. He understood the physical supply and demand, the actual barrels, separate from the headline.
His key insight being that Kuwait and oil are not the same thing in terms of market reaction.
Exactly. He separated the dominant story war equals higher prices from the underlying reality of the inventories. He had that deep, tacit grasp of the physical market, not just the political narrative swirling around it.
And the result was astonishing?
Completely counter-narrative. Oil collapsed. It went from $39 a barrel down to almost half that.
And Tony
turned his $300,000 bet into $18 million.
Wow.
The lesson Taleb draws is critical. Good speculative bets comes to you. You don't get them by just staying focused on the news or building complex theories. Often the opportunity is simpler, more elementary.
And people with too much smoke and complicated tricks and methods in their brains start missing elementary, very elementary things.
Right. Unlike academics, real-world practitioners like Tony were selected for survival, not complications. Their success depends on seeing what is, not just what the theories say should be.
This principle isn't just about trading, though. It extends further, right? Like with Jim Simons at Renaissance Technologies.
Absolutely. Simons is maybe the apex example of this kind of de-intellectualized practical success, the mathematician who changed Wall Street.
Generated the most amount of hedge fund returns in history, more than Buffett even. An incredible record.
Truly staggering. And his approach is completely radical, a direct challenge to traditional finance.
He claims he never hires economists and financial people.
Right? Just physicists and
Yeah.
mathematicians, people who are brilliant at pattern recognition, at assessing the internal logic of things without theorizing.
And crucially, he never listens to economics or reads reports.
Never. Their success is built purely on quantitative models identifying statistical anomalies, correlations, patterns in market data. There's no underlying economic narrative, no story about why the market is moving. It's pure data-driven pragmatism.
The green lumber fallacy executed at an industrial scale, understanding the market's behavior without needing the human story behind it.
Precisely. But then what about the theorists? What about those who do have deep theoretical knowledge but are also aware of its limits?
That brings us to Ariel Rubinstein.
Yes, the great economist, a leader in game theory.
Hmm.
Taleb holds him up as someone who gets the green lumber fallacy.
Why? Because he's honest about the limits of theory.
Exactly. Rubinstein embodies intellectual honesty. He refuses to claim his theoretical knowledge can be translated by him into anything directly practical.
He sees economics as, what was it, like fable?
Yes, meant to simulate ideas, maybe indirectly inspire practice, but certainly not to direct or determine practice.
Yeah.
He believes theory should stay independent from practice and vice versa. He understands the map is not the territory.
And he has that wonderful, humbling anecdote about the market vendor.
Oh, the suck story. It's perfect. He tried to get a Levantan vendor to use game theory for bargaining, suggesting a theoretically optimal method.
How did that go?
It failed to produce a price acceptable to both parties. The vendor, relying on generations of practical experience, basically said, look, for generations we've done it our way, now you come and try to change it.
And Rubinstein's reaction?
He concluded, I parted from him, shamefaced. A beautiful admission of how evolved practical wisdom can trump imposed abstract theory.
It really challenges that top-down expert knows best mentality.
It does. And it connects to Taleb's broader warning. Even when an economic theory makes sense, its application cannot be imposed from a model in a top-down manner.
Like the idea of specialization.
Right. Concepts like specialization, which economists have loved since Ricardo, sound great in theory. But Taleb argues they can blow up countries when imposed by policymakers because they remove redundancy and make economies brittle, error-prone.
So these things work better when they evolve organically.
Exactly. When they're reached progressively by evolutionary means with the right buffers and layers of redundancies, it's about adaptation, trial and error, accumulated wisdom, not grand, imposed designs.
The power of trial and error and tacit knowledge.
Okay, so we've dismantled the simple link between formal education and national wealth, and we've explored this deep divide between doing and talking with the green lumber fallacy. This brings us right back to that powerful idea from Seneca.
Sophistication is born of need and successive difficulties.
And necessity is the mother of invention. This feels absolutely central to understanding Taleb's core concept of antifragility, doesn't it?
It's the absolute bedrock. For Taleb, true strength, true robustness, actually, more than robustness, antifragility, it arises directly from encountering and overcoming adversity, stress, volatility.
He uses that personal example of his ancestral village, Amon.
Yes, a very powerful story. The village was punished and evacuated during the war, its people scattered into exile. His own family house was dynamited, devastation. But then, 25 years later, it became opulent, having bounced back with vengeance. The dynamited house was rebuilt, bigger and better, his father's calm observation. People from Mum only do well when shaken.
That's antifragility right there. Not just surviving the shock, but improving because of it, getting stronger from the stress.
Exactly. It's the opposite of fragile, and it's much more than just being resilient or robust. It's gaining from disorder.
And this ability, this antifragility, it's fundamentally linked to having optionality, isn't it? Being able to spot and exploit those betting opportunities with big upside and small downside.
Yes, that asymmetry is key.
But here's the provocative part. Taleb claims you don't learn optionality in school. In fact, he says school can make you blind to it. Can you unpack that? What exactly is optionality in this context, and why would formal education suppress it?
Okay, optionality fundamentally is about having choices, specifically choices with that asymmetrical payoff profile. Limited, known downside, but potentially huge, uncapped upside. Think of a simple financial option. You pay a small premium, your max loss, but if the market moves your way, your profit can be enormous.
So it's about creating situations with favorable asymmetry.
Exactly. In life, it's about setting yourself up to experiment, to try many things, to make small, reversible mistakes, knowing that most experiments might yield little, but one or two could lead to massive breakthroughs or opportunities. It's about having the freedom to benefit from randomness and uncertainty rather than being harmed by it.
And why does school make us blind to this?
Well, think about traditional schooling. It often optimizes for predictability, for following instructions, for getting the single right answer, for minimizing errors. It rewards conformity to a set curriculum.
Which isn't how the real messy world works.
Right. It subtly trains us away from embracing uncertainty, from tinkering, from taking those small, potentially valuable risks that don't fit the syllabus. It can make us averse to anything outside the predictable path, which paradoxically makes us more fragile to unexpected events. Optionality thrives on variance. Traditional education often tries to suppress it.
This tension, this conflict between formal learning and cultivating optionality. It leads us to that Greek legend he uses, right? The brothers Prometheus and Epimetheus.
Yes, the two titans. Hugely symbolic for Taleb.
Prometheus means forethinker.
Right. He represents progress, innovation, proactive intervention. He gave fire to humanity an experimental act. He embodies optionality, making those forays into the future of opportunism. Crucially, he represents the idea of the reversible and benign mistake, trying something, learning from it, even if it doesn't work perfectly, without catastrophic consequences.
And Epimetheus, afterthinker.
Exactly. He represents backward thinking, looking only at the past, staleness. He's the one who accepted Pandora's gift, unleashing unforeseen problems and then trying to understand or explain it afterwards. He symbolizes our tendency to create narratives to fit past events rather than acting intelligently before the fact, in the face of uncertainty.
So the core difference is about how we engage with the unknown future.
Precisely. Optionality, the Promethean way, is the only way to domesticate certainty, to work rationally without understanding the future. You don't need perfect prediction, you need the ability to benefit from what happens.
Whereas relying on narratives, the Epimethean way,
Ironically leaves you domesticated by certain uncertainty. You're trapped by trying to fit the unpredictable future into the neat boxes of past experience or elegant theories. You cannot look at the future by naive projection of the past.
it really highlights that gap between theory and practice again, like Yogi Berra said.
In theory, there is no difference between theory and practice. In practice, there is.
It perfectly captures that intellectual blind spot Taleb keeps pointing to, doesn't it? It's hard for those immersed in theory to truly grasp that messy reality of practice.
It really is. Their world is built on the idea that practice should conform to theory. So if formal intellect, formal education can sometimes lead to fragility, can conflict with the tinkering needed for optionality, what's the alternative path?
What does Taleb propose?
He points towards a de-intellectualized form of risk-taking in an opaque world, relying on trial and error, but specifically risk-taking with less downside, often using what he calls a barbell strategy.
Barbell, like weights.
Sort of. It means concentrating your resources at the extremes. Keep most of your assets extremely safe, low risk, protected from big negative shocks. Then take a small portion and allocate it to extremely high risk, high potential upside ventures things with massive optionality. Avoid the moderate risk middle ground, where you often get mediocre returns but are still exposed to significant hidden risks.
So hyper-conservative plus hyper-aggressive, avoid the mushy middle.
That's the essence. It's a strategy designed to survive the unpredictable and benefit from positive surprises, which he argues is the only rational way to operate in a world you can't accurately predict.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, you mentioned earlier that practitioners, the doers, can sometimes hold false beliefs that are nevertheless useful. Taleb calls these instrumental narratives, right? Not necessarily true, but helpful.
Yes, that's a key concept. An instrumental narrative isn't about objective, factual truth, what he calls epistemological truth. It's about whether the story serves a useful, practical purpose.
Can you give an example?
Sure. He suggests religious stories might have no value as narrative in a literal historical sense, but they might give you to do something convex and antifragile you otherwise would not do, like mitigate risks. They provide moral frameworks, social cohesion, rituals that might reduce certain dangers or encourage beneficial long-term behaviors.
So the story isn't true, but following it leads to good outcomes.
Potentially, yes. Or think of the simpler example. English parents control children with the false narrative that if they didn't behave or eat at dinner, or some wild animal might come and take them away.
The bogeyman.
Right. The story of the wild animal is factually false, but it's instrumental in achieving the desired behavior, getting the child to eat their greens.
And the danger comes when?
The danger, Taleb warns repeatedly, is when intellectuals tend to believe them their own be and take that ideas too literally, and that is vastly dangerous. They mistake these useful fictions, these instrumental narratives, for objective scientific truth. Then they try to build grand theories or policies on top of them, which inevitably leads to fragility because the foundation wasn't solid reality in the first place.
So if this practical instrumental wisdom doesn't come from textbooks or formal theories, where does it reside? How is it transmitted?
It resides in heuristics, those rules of thumb, the practical wisdom that's embedded in tradition and passed down tacitly, often unconsciously through generations. It's the accumulated, time-tested knowledge of populations refined by the ultimate filter, survival.
This connects to Karl Popper's idea of evolutionary epistemology.
Yes, the idea that knowledge itself evolves like biological traits through trial and error with less effective ideas being discarded over time, but Taleb adds his crucial twist. An idea does not survive because it is better than the competition, but rather because the person who holds it has survived accordingly.
Ah, so the survival of the holder is the proof of the idea's value, not necessarily its intellectual elegance or theoretical soundness.
Exactly. The ideas and practices that endure are those embedded in cultures and individuals who successfully navigated the messy, unpredictable world, who adapted and thrived. Their utility is proven by the harsh reality of survival, not by academic debate.
And this leads directly to that incredibly potent, almost radical conclusion he draws. The one that really flips our usual hierarchy of knowledge.
You mean?
Wisdom you learn from your grandmother should be vastly superior to what you get from a class in business school.
Boom. Yes, that's quite a statement, isn't it? It directly challenges the prestige and perceived value of modern, formalized, credentialed knowledge. It elevates that ancestral, lived, practical, tacit knowledge above theoretical frameworks.
Because your grandmother's wisdom is the distilled essence of what actually worked for survival and well-being over generations.
Precisely. It carries the weight of evolutionary proof, not just intellectual fashion.
This brings us then to what Taleb identifies as expert problems.
Right. Situations in which the expert knows a lot, but less than he thinks he does.
The danger of overconfidence born from theoretical knowledge that hasn't been fully tested by messy reality.
Exactly. And that overconfidence, the illusion of understanding, often brings fragilities and acceptance of ignorance. They become blind to the risks outside their models precisely because they trust their models too much.
And the inverse relationship is key to anti-fragility.
Yes. When you are fragile, you need to know a lot more than when you are anti-fragile. If your system is brittle, you need perfect prediction. If it's anti-fragile, you can thrive amidst uncertainty.
And conversely, when you think that you know more than you do, you are fragile.
Beautifully put. Overconfidence in your knowledge is fragility. The less you need to know to succeed, the more anti-fragile you are, because you're not dependent on accurate forecasts or complete understanding.
So wrapping this all together, the big picture emerging from this deep dive is
It's that anti-fragile risk-taking, not education and formal organized research, is largely responsible for innovation and growth. Real progress often bubbles up from the bottom, from practitioners experimenting, tinkering, taking risks with optionality, embracing the messiness.
while the story is dressed up by textbook writers, after the fact, creating neat, clean narratives that often miss the real drivers.
Exactly. We get fooled into overestimating the role of good-sounding ideas and theories, and we systematically downgrade the crucial, often silent wisdom of the doers, the artisans, the grandmothers. We fall into the green lumber fallacy constantly, mistaking the articulate explanation for the effective action, the map for the territory. Outro.
Wow. We've covered a huge amount of ground there, really diving deep into Nassim Taleb's challenging insights from Antifragile.
It certainly makes you rethink some fundamental assumptions, doesn't it?
Absolutely. We've seen how those deeply held beliefs about knowledge leading to wealth can be, well, misleading, and how that green lumber fallacy reveals such a crucial, often ignored gap between the doers and the talkers.
It really emphasizes why that practical street-smart wisdom, the kind honed by direct experience, by having skin in the game, by facing real-world stressors, often wins out over elegant theories in the long run.
This whole deep dive really pushes us to reconsider where true value, where resilience, where actual growth comes from.
It does. It's a call to embrace optionality, to understand the incredible power of trial and error, and maybe to recognize that genuine anti-fragility often emerges from adapting to difficulty, even gaining from disorder, rather than just sticking rigidly to pre-planned theoretical paths.
It's about questioning those surface narratives, isn't it?
Mm.
Looking for the deeper, maybe messier, but ultimately more robust reality underneath.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So as you, our listeners, reflect on all this, here's maybe a final provocative thought to carry with you, something to chew on from Taleb's world. Given these insights, how might you approach learning or making decisions or even just defining what success really means differently in your own life? What green lumber, what unquestioned assumption might you be mistaking in your own view of how things work?
And perhaps even more importantly, what crucial, maybe unnarrated, unseen optionality might you be missing out on simply by relying too heavily on conventional wisdom or the expert view?